It's very hard to understand the importance of proclaiming that Black Lives Matter if you don't understand American history. And particularly if you don't understand the American history of policing in communities of color. Because if you don't understand that history, then to proclaim and to demand that Black Lives Matter seems like something special. So folks trip out and they freak out. Oh, well, Black lives, well, all lives matter. Yes, sweetheart, they do. That is true and utterly irrelevant to the current moment. Of course, all lives matter. Nobody said otherwise. But you don't have to proclaim that which is taken for granted. You have to proclaim that which is ignored.
No.
You see, when white people say all, we never meant it. Black people know that. Brown people know that. Most white people never had to really learn that. So we said all men are created equal, and we didn't mean that shit. You see, we said it, but we didn't mean it. We said it, and we wrote black people and brown folks out of all. So when black people of color hear, when black and brown folks hear all lives matter, what they hear is the same thing they heard with all men are created equal, that it was a setup, that it was a lie that didn't include them. So if you want to actually make it clear that all lives matter, A, you got to act like all lives matter, and you got to really treat people like all lives matter, and B, you have to proclaim that the lives that you denigrated for centuries actually matter, because that is the part that gets left out. You see? So when we say all lives matter, just to put this in perspective, how ridiculous this comeback is, how absurd, how sophomoric, how nonsensical it is for us to respond to Black Lives Matter with all lives matter. Let's take it back to like 1971 when the title, when the phrase, when the statement on the street was what? Black is beautiful. That was the way that black folks were trying to take back notions of beauty from a fashion industry, from a glamour industry that had basically defined beauty as white, right? And so black folks were saying black is beautiful, reclaiming their own beauty standards and norms. To say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter would be like getting in a time machine tonight, going back to 1971, hearing somebody say black is beautiful and interrupting them so as to let them know, well, we're all beautiful in our own way. Yes, shut up, we know. Sort of misses the point. Be like going back to the early 80s, right, when the HIV/AIDS crisis hit. And in those first few years of the HIV/AIDS crisis, remember, we had a government that did nothing. President Reagan sat by and watched thousands of people die before he even uttered the term AIDS. He only said something because his buddy Rock Hudson from the movies died of it. And then he decided he would speak on it and begin to cut loose some research funds for it. But for the first couple of years, didn't want to say anything about it, right? And there were activist groups out in the street, right? ACT UP, Gay Men's Health Crisis, others out in the street demanding funding for AIDS research. And what they were in effect saying, even though they didn't use the term and even though we didn't have hashtags in those days, right? Ultimately what they were saying was people with AIDS lives matter. So to say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter would be like going back to one of those rallies in 1982, 1983, interrupting the rally for AIDS funding to remind everyone that, well, people die of pancreatic cancer too. Yes, sweetheart, and totally irrelevant to the current situation. You have to demand recognition of the thing that gets swept under the rug. That's black life, that's brown life, that's people of color, you see, because we are a country built on the premise that black lives didn't matter. And I know we don't want to hear that, but that's just truth. We're built on a society that said that black lives didn't matter except insofar as they could provide cheap labor to enrich white people.
Hey, what's up, fam? How you doing? I hope you're doing super great wherever you are today. As you know, this is represented Jinjuk Stories, and I'm hoping that you are great. Now, the scholars who came with critical race theory, they were not mad by coming up with it, because there's a section called intersectionality. Intersectionality states that there is a group of people that identify with certain values that sometimes might not apply to majority of the group, right? For example, let's say black folks. In black folks, you need to understand the struggles that black people go through. Now, usually when black people talk about the Black Lives Matter, it is usually met with aggressiveness. People respond by all lives matter. But in today's video, we are here to find out why is this usually happening to black folks, because for the longest time, they are always trying to share their opinions. They're always trying to share the things that they are going through. And this video today is going to be presented by Tim Wise, who is a well-known anti-racist educator who has extensively analyzed why white people respond to Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter. He argues that this reaction is rooted in white fragility, historical denial, and unwillingness to confront systemic racism. It represents a defensive response that divert attention away from black struggles, while upholding the illusion of racial equality. The phrase Black Lives Matter was never meant to suggest that only Black Lives Matter value, but rather to highlight that Black lives have been historically devalued by systemic racism. However, many white people interpret this statement as exclusionary or as an attack on their own racial identity, which exposes deep anxieties about race and privilege. This response revealed an ingrained resistance among white Americans to acknowledging racial injustices, as it challenges the narrative of meritocracy and equality that have been deeply embedded in American society. By countering Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter, white individuals attempt to reframe the discussion in a way that removes the focus from black oppression and instead promotes a superficial, colorblind perspective that ignores racial disparities. This is important because this has been happening for the longest time. And they think that this will really hurt black people for doing this, or they feel like they are not represented in this. When you look at black American history, it has always tried to exclude the black history. These are always ways of trying to remind America that true black people also form part and parcel of black history. And indeed, Black Lives Matter. So, Mr. Tim Wise tried to share this information with us, and I hope we all get to learn. I hope we find value from his page that he shares. But I feel like it's important for us to get to have a look. And hey, just a quick question. For those who are watching us for the first time, I'll ask you, please hit the subscribe button, like, share, so that people who are like-minded like you can get and have this information. And I would like to thank all people who have subscribed to the channel, people who are sharing my videos, and people who are supporting me, people who are buying me coffee through my Cash App account. I'll really appreciate if you buy me a coffee through my Cash App account. It's just on my bio. And those who are also sending me super thanks, get to know that I receive it and I highly appreciate the service that you're doing unto me. Until then, I want us to watch this video. I'll be back, and then, as usual, I've prepared a presentation that we are all gonna be learning from, besides what Mr. Tim Wise, this American anti-racist educator, who is trying to share with us. So let's watch the video. As usual, I'll be back and we'll have a discussion about this.
That was how black folks were viewed, as cheap labor, expendable labor. I should also point out, it is how indigenous people were viewed, as people who could be expendable and committed genocide against without hesitation. It was also the way that many Asian Americans were viewed when they were brought here from places like China to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, worked to death, didn't care if they died or not. It's the way that Latino folks were viewed when in the 1930s we expelled tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands actually, of Mexican Americans who were citizens of this country, and we sent them back to Mexico in spite of their citizenship to free up jobs for white men. You didn't learn that in high school history. Maybe you ought to ask your history teacher why. Because it's not contestable, it's not arguable, it's not like there's a rebuttal to what I just said. That happened. But we didn't learn about it because black and brown lives historically have not mattered, except insofar as they serve the interest of the dominant group. Now, we can either deal with that and be honest about it, or we can keep running from it and acting like it didn't happen. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't understand that history, it becomes very difficult, doesn't it, to understand the current moment. You can't understand the movement against police misconduct if you don't understand the history of policing in this country vis-a-vis people of color. See, black and brown folks know this history because it's embedded on their DNA. It's embedded in their family stories. They've had to learn it as a way to stay alive. But those of us called white haven't had to learn any of this. So we don't have to know the fact that modern policing traces back to slave patrols. That's where it comes from. What was the slave patrol? It was the thing that rich white people created to take poor white people and have them control black folks. Those of us who don't come from wealth might want to think about what that trick was. Right? Elites who owned other people telling the rest of us, some of us poor white folks who didn't own anybody, hey, you're still part of the team. You can go control these black people for us. See, that was a trick that rich folks played on poor folks to make poor white folks think that they had more in common with rich white people than they did with black people. Some shit doesn't change. That still happens today. That is still the way that we operate today. And if people don't understand that, it's because they don't understand how that system works. So take it back to like 20 years ago now, right? A little over 20 years ago, the OJ verdict. I know there have been a couple. I mean, the first one. The first O.J. Simpson verdict, right? This verdict when O.J. Simpson was accused of, tried for, and ultimately acquitted of double murder in 1995, right? And you remember there was a big divide racially in this country, right? Black folks, about 2 out of 3, said that they agreed with the verdict. The acquittal they believed was just, doesn't mean they thought he was innocent, by the way. I talked to a lot of black folks at that time. They were like, oh, I think he did that shit. But y'all made the rules, and under the rules that you made about reasonable doubt, I think you did not meet your burden. So you made the rules, you live by the rules. 2/3 of white folks were like, oh my God, this is the most awful miscarriage of justice. I can't believe, how in the world does this happen? This is the system was great until like 2 minutes ago. And then OJ walked, and oh God, what the hell's going on in this country? Right? Major racial divide. But listen, you know what? That racial divide made sense. It made perfect sense. I don't think it was because white people were racist and unfeeling and uncaring. Hell, white folks had loved OJ for like 20 years, man. OJ was done with black folks. Black folks were done with OJ. Like OJ had walked, I'm just being honest, like OJ was not a black problem. Like OJ had walked away from black people. Like he grew up in Hunters Point in San Francisco, went to USC right there in the hood in South Los Angeles, and said when he left USC, like he didn't ever want to go back. He never wanted to go. So he started making Naked Gun movies that like only white people saw. And then he was like running through the airports in those Hertz commercials, selling rental cars to white people. Like white folks loved OJ until he did something that reminded them of a stereotype they had about black men. Then it was like, oh, he's black people's problem again, right? But OJ, so 2/3 of white folks didn't like the verdict. 2/3 of black folks liked the verdict, believed it was just, and that made perfect sense because what happened, if you remember the case, and if you don't, let me just fill you in real quick. One of the reasons that there was any kind of reasonable doubt was because one of the chief investigators who found a disproportionate amount of the blood evidence was revealed to be an overt racist. Right? So when black folks hear that, when they hear that there's a cop who found the evidence implicating a black man in the murder of 2 white people who regularly uses the N-word in an overtly racist way, then somehow, like alarm bells go off in black heads. Right? And by the same token, white folks don't hear those alarm bells because we're like, well, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Planting evidence on people. Who does that? That's bizarre. That makes no sense at all. That doesn't happen. No, it doesn't happen to us. But it does happen to people of color. There's a long history of that. In fact, not only is there a long history, at the very moment that the O.J. Simpson trial was taking place, 1994, 1995, at that very moment, we come to find out a few years later, if you paid attention to the news out of Los Angeles, that in fact there were dozens of officers in the LAPD who were at that very moment engaged in a pattern of misconduct and abuse and planting evidence on suspects of color to sweeten the deal against them in various prosecutions. It became the Rampart scandal. You can look that up. It was one division of the LAPD. It was happening at the very same time as that trial. So when black folks said, we think evidence might have been planted, and white folks said, that's paranoid nonsense, in fact, it wasn't. It was rooted in a reality, in a recognition that that stuff happens. Doesn't mean that that's what happened in the OJ case. It doesn't mean that that evidence was planted, but it does mean that to wonder if that's possible, given the revelations about Mark Furman, the officer in that case, wasn't paranoid. It wasn't irrational. It was rooted in one's actual experience. And if you haven't had that experience, it's just as logical for you to think it makes no sense. Right? In other words, our attitudes about race come from our experiences with race. So if we don't see something and somebody else does, it's not because we're bad people and they're good people, or we're stupid and they're more intelligent. It's just you don't have to think about stuff, so you don't. That's what white privilege really is when it comes to race. It's about the privilege of having the ability to be stone cold ignorant to other people's truth, being oblivious to other people's truth. White privilege is the blue pill from the Matrix, is what it is. Right? If you ever saw the film The Matrix, and if you haven't, you should go see it, but just the first one. The other two suck. Like, the trilogy's awful, but the first one is damn good, right? Keanu Reeves plays Neo, and Lawrence Fishburne plays Morpheus, and there's this scene early on in the film where Morpheus offers Neo two pills. One is blue, one is red, right? And he says, you can take the blue pill, and the story ends, and you wake up, and you remain oblivious, and you don't have to know what's really going on. Just like most people in this society, they don't want to know what's happening. They don't really want to know. They'd rather die than know the truth. Or you can take the red pill, and I can offer you enlightenment, and I can take you down the rabbit hole, and I can show you just how far it goes. And Neo takes the red pill, and he starts to see, if you've seen the movie, right? Starts to see all the stuff that's going on that he never knew about. That is how identity functions in this country. It's how white identity functions, male identity, straight identity, able-bodied identity, affluent rich folk identity. When you're a member of any dominant group, you have the luxury of being on the blue pill and not having to know the truth, right? If you're the target of a system of oppression, you got to take the red pill just to figure out what the hell is going on, just so you don't lose your mind, right? Just so you can make some sense of your world. But if you're the dominant group, you're like on a blue pill IV drip from the day you come out of your mama's womb. Right, you're walking around with this damn IV, you don't even know you got it there. And then people of color are like, hey, you see all this racism? And we're like, no, got the blue pill. I don't see nothing. Men, right, same thing, on the blue pill. I know that being men and on the blue pill means some different stuff. In the modern pharmaceutical era, that's pharmaceutical humor. You're welcome. Men don't have to know anything about sexism, patriarchy, rape culture if we don't want to know it. Those of us who are straight or cisgender, we don't have to know about straight supremacy, about homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia. Maybe we do know something, but if so, it's only because we probably listened to someone who was the target and decided to believe them, right? So ultimately, we don't have to, though. We have the luxury of being oblivious, taking the blue pill. So we have to be clear about this, because people of color don't have that luxury. So they know what goes on right now with law enforcement. They know places like New York City, stop and frisk policies, right, that over the course of about a decade stopped, what, hundreds of thousands, a couple million, several million, 2.5 million people were stopped by the stop and frisk policies of the NYPD. About 90% of them were people of color, right? And of those who were stopped, less than 5% were even issued a ticket because they hadn't done anything. So it's not like they were being stopped for actual criminal activity. They were being stopped on suspicion, and the suspicions were not justified in 95% of the instances. In less than 2% of the stops were drugs found. In less than 0.2% were weapons found. But that was the rationale they gave. Oh, we're trying to get drugs and weapons off the street. But they weren't finding drugs and weapons. What they were doing was taking black folks' names and putting them in a database so they could keep eyes on them. That's what stop and frisk was, and people of color know it. In this country, we know from the CDC and other sources that drug use and drug dealing is equivalent between white folks, black folks, and Latinos, contrary to popular belief, which says that it's black and brown folks who have and use and sell drugs. It's actually equivalent across racial lines, but we know that people of color 5 times more often are going to be arrested for drug possession, particularly for weed, and incarcerated on a drug-related offense. People of color know that, and they know that law enforcement is who does that. So that's why there's a skepticism toward police. That's why we have to proclaim that Black Lives Matter, because everything in the system says they don't. Right? They know the data. Even if they don't know the data, they know the reality behind the data, that young black men are about 21 times more likely to be shot and killed by law enforcement than young white men. Right? 2 to 3 times more likely when unarmed and posing no immediate threat. People of color know this. Whether they've done the research and know the exact numbers, or they just know it from their own experience. They know it. They know that young black children like Tamir Rice get shot dead in a public park doing what white boys do in this country every day, play with toy guns. White boys play with toy guns every day, and they do not get dropped by police. because those police view them as 20-year-old men, which is what happened in Cleveland, right? They didn't see him as a 12-year-old. They thought he was 20, right? Because we have animalized black men and we've made them older than they really are in our imaginations. This kid's playing with a toy gun, something that white people, and keep in mind, Ohio's an open carry state, right? So if he really was a 20-year-old male, which is what they thought at the time, he had a right to have a real gun, not a toy gun, a real gun. They had no right to shoot him, no right to come up on him, no right to say boo to him in a state that says you can walk around with weapons. White folks will take their weapons any damn place. We walk into Walmart with our guns. We walk into Chipotle. Seriously, Google that shit. Google, about a year and a half ago, white folks were like, I'm gonna take my weapons to Chipotle. It was like some demonstration or something, like just to show we could. We're going to Chipotle with our AR-15s. Why you gotta have an assault rifle at Chipotle? But you can't kill salmonella with the bullet. I know they ran out of carnitas that time, but damn, they'll get that back. You don't have to shoot them. Right? And white folks will walk into Walmart with the weapon, walk into Target with the weapon. Nobody does anything. Nobody shoots them. Cops don't roll up. John Crawford, on the other hand, in Ohio, also open carry state, right outside of Dayton, whatever it was, right? Picks up a weapon. It was an air gun, an air rifle. You're not going to kill anybody with an air rifle. And they sell those at the Target. He picks it up off the shelf or the Walmart, whichever it was. I think it was Walmart, right? He picks it up off the shelf. He's walking around. He's just sort of swinging it. He might be thinking of buying it. He's talking on the phone to his girlfriend, right? Some white dude sees him, freaks out, calls the cops. Oh, black guy walking around with a weapon at the Walmart. Yeah, he calls it in. It's a black guy with an afro. Okay, first of all, it's Twist. Let's get our black hair straight, please. Right. I mean, come on, white folks. You can just Google that shit. It's not that hard. Like, there's a difference between Twist and an afro. And look, can we try to get it straight without touching black people's hair? Can we do that too? Can we do that? So you can just look that up. You don't have to touch it. You don't have to touch it. You don't have to touch it just because you got a black roommate. You never seen one before. Can you get that wet? Can you swim? That's why they have the internet. Look it up. Right? So he calls in John Crawford, black dude with an afro. First of all, think about that. First of all, it's the wrong hairstyle. They're going to get some totally different black dude shot on like aisle 4 of the Walmart. They're going to roll up, find the dude with the afro, and kill him. But no, they found John Crawford. They come in. You can watch the video yourself. They roll up. The guy rolls up, turns the corner, opens fire immediately on John Crawford, who was posing no threat to anybody, drops him. At first, it doesn't kill him. John Crawford's stunned, dazed, probably in shock, gets up off the ground to figure out why is somebody shooting at me, moves into the aisle without the weapon, which is now not really a weapon. Like I said, it's an air rifle, sitting on the ground, and they shoot him again 5 times and drop him and kill him. No indictments. No indictments. And that officer was, by the way, the only officer in the history of that suburban Dayton Police Department ever to kill someone. He's now killed 2. That was his second. Still on the force and not indicted by the district attorney locally. So that is why people of color have to proclaim, and why we as white folks should as well, that Black Lives Matter. Because as long as the system allows that, what we're saying every day is that they don't. And if you have a system that screams every day that those lives don't matter, it takes those of us who believe otherwise to suggest the opposite. But it's a privilege, isn't it, to be oblivious to history? It is. It's a privilege to be able to be ignorant and still be considered educated. Right? How does that happen? How is it that we can not know these things and still be considered competent? Right? How is it that we can be considered competent to do anything, to teach children, to be a physician, to be a social worker, to be a psychologist, right? To vote and not know these things? Sort of interesting, isn't it? Right? Because there are certain things we are expected to know. Whatever the dominant group thinks we need to know, that's what we have to know. Right? That's why people of color, they have to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art. I know we don't call it that. That's sort of the point. When your stuff is the norm, you don't have to ever qualify it. You don't have to talk about where it came from. You don't have to call it white literature. It's just literature, theater, and poetry. and odd. Right? People of color have to know all that stuff that white folks decided was important. We as white folks don't have to know anything we don't want to know. And we can still be deemed competent. We can still be deemed intelligent. We can still get a high school diploma. We can still get a college degree, a master's degree, a law degree, a PhD. We can get any professional license for any job we want. We can go into black neighborhoods and teach black children, knowing nothing about them, their families, or their communities. Thinking that because we got 5 weeks of training with Teach for America, that we know what the hell we're talking about. Never been up in their space, never actually know anything about them, but just show up because we care. See, that's not how the real world works. That ignorance should mark us as incompetent, but it doesn't. And it's not just with regard to policing, it's with regard to a lot of other things, right? So I was thinking about this recently, about a year and a half ago. I was driving our daughters. I have 2 daughters. My wife and I have 2 daughters. They're 14 and 12 now. But about a year and a half ago, when they were 12 and a half and 10 and a half, I was driving them from school to dance. They're dancers. And at the time, they were dancing at the same studio, which was downtown, about, 8-10 minutes away from their school. And so I picked them up, and I'm driving the distance between the school and the studio. And at one point, you have to go through a public housing development to get to the studio, right? So we're at the stoplight, waiting for it to turn green, surrounded by public housing on both sides. And the 10-and-a-half-year-old, whose name is Rachel, takes this opportunity to ask me a question. She says, "Daddy, why is it that pretty much everybody in this neighborhood is black?" Right? Which is a really damn good question. Like, that is an excellent observation on her part. It's a very interesting sociological inquiry and anthropological inquiry. And my guess is that that wasn't the first day she'd noticed that the neighborhood was pretty much all black. It was just the first day she decided to ask, right? I'm sure she had noticed it. We've been driving that route for a year and a half at that point. So I'm sure that she had noticed it. But on that day, she decided to ask. And she probably asked because she figured Daddy might know, because Daddy talks about these things. So maybe he'll have the answer. Like, if I was an accountant, she wouldn't have asked me. She would have just been like, "How do I do my taxes?" And I would have been like, "Online, I don't know." You know? But so she asked the question. Now, here's the thing. She asked me, why is pretty much everyone in this neighborhood black? And of course, her sister, who's 12 and a half, wanting to show up her younger sister and impress her father, naturally decided to intervene with the wisdom that she had apparently obtained somewhere, don't know where. So the 12-and-a-half-year-old jumps in and says, "Redlining!" And this is strangely accurate. And for those of you who don't know what redlining means, because I know not everybody does, I will explain. Redlining is, in fact, part of the answer to the question that her sister asked. Redlining was a practice that was very formal for generations, right? Where banks would basically draw on a map in their office red lines around black neighborhoods. And essentially anybody that lived within the boundaries of that neighborhood, didn't matter what their personal credit history was, didn't matter what their income was, didn't matter what their occupational status was, didn't matter who they were. All that mattered was, you live in this neighborhood, you ain't getting a loan. Right? And that's how black and brown communities were starved of wealth and starved of resources. And so when the 12-and-a-half-year-old butts in and says, "Redlining," she's not wrong, although it was weird. And the 10-and-a-half-year-old then says, "Yeah, I don't know what that means." And I said, "Yeah, neither does your sister. She's just showing off." She probably heard me say that at some point, and she was partially right. So then I proceeded to spend the next 2.5 or 3 minutes sort of giving her a real brief history lesson, right, about the way that certain people were allowed to live in various neighborhoods and other people were not. Public housing, as it turns out, was created in the 1930s for poor white people, right? Black folks weren't even allowed in public housing in most cases. Poor Latino folks, they weren't allowed in public housing. It was set up for poor white folks. But roughly at the same time, the government also started to do some other things, which very quickly allowed white folks to move out of public housing, right? So we created the FHA loan program, the VA loan program, the GI Bill later on, maybe 10, 15 years later. And that allowed white folks almost exclusively to hustle it out to the suburbs where only we were allowed to live, keeping those who weren't allowed to live there in the cities. Now you had white folks able to leave for greener pastures, black folks still trapped in urban areas in public housing. It wasn't an accident. It was the result of deliberate decisions to prefer white people and to give us a leg up and to denigrate black people because, again, historically, systemically, black lives did not matter. Right? And so I tell my daughter this, and it's like a 3-minute lesson. It's not like a big, huge discourse. You know, it's 3 minutes, and she's like, "Oh, okay, now I understand." But the important thing I want you to understand about that story is, what if I don't know the answer? And I would gather that a lot of families don't, particularly a lot of white parents, wouldn't know the answer to that question. Again, this is what I do, so I know the answer, right? But a lot of folks wouldn't know because they were never taught. So I actually asked a group of parents about 2 weeks later, what would you have said if your kid had asked that? And they were all like, I don't know. I don't know that I knew the answer. And maybe I would have changed the subject. See, there's a problem, right? Because if we don't know the answer and our children are thinking that, and not just the white kids, by the way, kids of color too, we're starting to wonder, why is this neighborhood all black and brown? Why is this poor neighborhood in particular all black and brown? If I'm a black kid, I'm wondering that. If I'm a white kid, I'm wondering that. And you know what? If I don't know the answer, do you think my child isn't going to fill in the blanks herself? Oh no, she's going to fill in the blanks. And do you know what she's going to fill in the blank with? She's going to fill it in with the default position of this culture. What do you think the default position is in this society? What is our creation myth? What is our secular gospel? You know it as well as I. Everybody raised here or who was born and has lived here for any particular amount of time knows the answer. The secular gospel is what? That idea that, well, wherever you end up in life, it's all about you. You can make it if you just try hard enough, right? That notion of rugged individualism and meritocracy, right? Which history proves is a lie. But if I don't know history, my kid defaults to that because that's what she's hearing. She's hearing that wherever you end up, it's all about you. So if you made it out of the hood, it's because you must have had a better work ethic or better DNA or whatever, a stronger family. And if you're still trapped there, there's something wrong with you. Obviously, you're inferior in some way, culturally, biologically, in terms of family structure. That's the default position. The fact that it's not true doesn't matter. The fact that we all know it's more complicated than that. We all know people, don't we, who worked hard their whole life, have nothing to show for it. We also know people who were born on third base, think they hit a triple, and haven't actually had to work hard at all in their lives. We all know that it's more complicated, but children don't know how to process that. So if they ask that question and we don't know the history, they're going to assume the reason these people are over here and we're all over here is because we're better. And they're worse. So in other words, you see the pernicious element of this. Racism gets reinforced just by the normal workings of the society. It doesn't require anyone to actually sit you down and teach you racism. It doesn't require someone to sit you down and say, these people are better and these people are inferior. All you have to do is just look around, see the inequality, and have no answer for why. And the only answer you're given is the one that rationalizes it, rugged individualism. Just as a side note, there is no such thing as a rugged individual. Right? In fact, I would argue there's no such thing as an individual. What the hell is an individual? Human beings have always lived in a social context. Right? If you ever meet someone who's really a rugged individual.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are super great. Now, we've all watched the video and I do believe that there is always something to learn. And this explains a lot of things that as a community, we always want to learn, we always want to get and want to know and learn more about it, right? Now, there are a lot of arguments that Dr. Tim Wise gives in regards to the Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. Tim Wise argues that one of the main reasons why white people push back the All Lives Matter is due to misunderstanding of the purpose of Black Lives Matter. Many white individuals operate under the assumption that the Black Lives Matter claim of black superiority rather than a movement aimed at achieving racial justice. This misconception stems from the historical conditioning of whiteness as a default or universal experience. In white-dominated societies, whiteness is seen as the norm, and when marginalized groups advocate for their rights, it is often perceived as a challenge to white dominance, rather than an effort to achieve equality. White individuals who say all lives matter believe they are promoting inclusivity, but in reality, they are dismantling the urgency of issues that the Black Lives Matter seek to address. Issues like police brutality, racial profiling, economic inequality. The refusal to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter are uniquely at risk within racist systems lead to a defensive posture where white individuals see themselves as victims rather than beneficiaries of racial privilege. And this is true because I talked about the Black history. And in as much as you seeing Black history books being banned, being revoked out of the curriculum, and this explains to you a lot of things that you I mean, we need to understand a lot of things that we need to know. And so it is important for us to keep in mind that when we talk about the Black Lives Matter, we are trying to reflect on those things in the past and present that are being overlooked by the same very system that put black people where they are today. Now, I also continue by explaining another key reason behind the All Lives Matter response, as Wise explains, is what is called white fragility. If you get to look sometimes back, I did a video about white fragility where D'Angelo explains white fragility. This is a concept by Robin DiAngelo. White fragility refers to the discomfort and defensiveness many white individuals exhibit when confronted with discussions about racism. For centuries, white people have been shielded from the realities of racial oppression, and when they are forced to confront these issues, they often experience emotional distress. Instead of reflecting on the reality that black people face disproportionate violence and discrimination, they react with anger, denial, or attempts to silence the conversation, saying all lives matter is a way to dismiss black grievances without having to confront personal or collective complicity in systemic racism. It allows white individuals to maintain a sense of innocence while simultaneously invalidating the lived experiences of the black community. And this is true because the history has been about you. Why would you just try give black folks a chance to also express themselves? All lives matter, it's true. But has it been all really? It's all been about you, right? So this is the time when black folks at least came to be included, to be heard, to be felt their grievances, right? Another thing that I would like to say is that Wise also connects this reaction to the historical pattern of white resistance to black-led movements throughout the American history. Whenever black people have organized to challenge racial injustice, there has been a corresponding effort by white individuals to reframe or undermine the movement. During the civil rights movement, for example, many white moderates insisted that black activities should be patient and work within existing legal frameworks rather than engaging in protest or direct action. Similarly, when Dr. Martin King Luther King Jr. spoke out against racial and economic injustices, many white Americans dismissed his activism as divisive or too radical. This response of all lives matter followed this same pattern. It's a rhetorical tool used to neutralize black resistance by shifting the focus away from racial injustices and replacing it with a vague, depoliticized call for unity that ultimately serves to maintain the status quo. Now, it's true that they're trying to neutralize the system and they're trying to maintain the status quo, because when the voices of black people have been heard, it only means that the things that they were getting, the privileges that they were getting, will now be not considered, as the attention will be diverting to what black folks have been trying to talk about for the longest time. Another critical point Wise makes is that all lives matter. Response is often deliberate act of deflection. They're trying to deflect from the main point, and that's critical. Many white individuals understand, at least on some level, that systemic racism exists, but they fear what acknowledging it might require of them. Recognizing that Black Lives Matter are being systematically devalued will mean accepting that white privilege is real and the white people, whether consciously or not, benefit from racial inequality. Rather than facing this uncomfortable truth, some white individuals choose to redirect the conversation by insisting that all lives should be focused. This rhetorical move is meant to shut down discussions about race while appearing morally righteous. as it allows white individuals to claim that they are promoting unity rather than division. However, as Wise explains, unity cannot be achieved without first addressing the specific injustices that black communities face. Simply saying that all lives matter does nothing to dismantle racial inequality. Instead, it minimizes black suffering and perpetuates a culture of silence around systemic racism. Isn't that true? That is true. Because when we say all lives matter, okay, which is true, but understand the concept. The concept behind Black Lives Matter. It is because the history has always been for white folks, but it is just for the first time that black people are requesting, that black people are asking for inclusivity. To also get to know that really also Black Lives Matter. It is not all about you talking about police brutality and all these things that have been going on. It is a knock on the door trying to ask you to also be in, put the inclusivity, right? Make it understandable that also black lives really matter. Now, Wise also highlights the phrase all lives matter is rarely applied in situations outside racial justice discussion. When people say save the rainforests, they are dismissing the importance of other forests. When people say breast cancer awareness, they are not implying that other forms of cancer do not matter. Yet the argument, when people say save the rainforests, they are they're not dismissing the importance of other forests. When people say breast cancer awareness, they are not implying that other forms of cancer do not matter. Yet, when black people say Black Lives Matter, many white individuals feel personally attacked and respond with all lives matter. This reaction reveals an underlying racial bias. Even if unconscious, that causes many white people to resist recognizing the unique injustices that black people face. The phrase, all lives matter, is not used as a genuine statement of equality, but rather as a mechanism to derail discussions about race injustices and prevent meaningful change. That has been a good example that has been used. Because when you say the breast cancer awareness, we're not saying that all types of cancer doesn't matter, but it is just a special way of feeling included to this group of people, right? That when I was talking about intersectionality. Another important aspect Dr. Wise discusses is how all lives matter response serves to reinforce white identity and white supremacy. The creation of whiteness as a racial category has always been about establishing a hierarchy where white lives are valued above all others. The insistence on saying all lives matter while ignoring the specific injustices black people face maintains this hierarchy by refusing to acknowledge black suffering. If all lives truly matter in American society, there would be no movement like Black Lives Matter. True. The very existence of Black Lives Matter is a response to the system that continuously devalues black life, whether through police violence, mass incarceration, economic inequality. By rejecting this reality, white individuals say all lives matter, are ultimately protecting the racial order that privileges whiteness while denying black people the right to advocate for their own humanity. I'm also going to continue. Wise also connect this issue to the psychological impact of white guilt and denial. Many white individuals experience guilt when confronted with discussions about racism, but instead of using the guilt as a catalyst for change, they seek ways to avoid responsibility by saying all lives matter. Allow white people to absolve themselves of any obligation to engage with racial justice. It is clear it is easier to deny the existence of systemic racism than to acknowledge that one benefits from it. This refusal to engage with history and contemporary racial disparities keep racism intact. as it prevents meaningful conversations about how to dismantle oppressive systems. Wise emphasizes that true allyship requires white individuals to move beyond guilt and into action, which means listening to black voices rather than attempting to silence them. Now, lastly, Tim Wise explains that all lives matter response is not an innocent misunderstanding. It is assumption of larger refusal among many white people to engage with realities of racism. It is a reaction rooted in fragility, defensiveness, and desire to maintain the illusion of racial harmony without addressing injustice. Saying Black Lives Matter does not mean other lives are less valuable. It is a necessary statement in a society that has repeatedly treated Black Lives Matter as disposal. Until white people stop deflecting and start engaging in serious discussions about racial inequality, movements like Black Lives Matter will remain necessary. True justice requires not just acknowledging that Black Lives Matter, but actively working to create a world where the statement is no longer controversial. These are presenter Jindok Stories, and I'm hoping that you grade and fine from wherever you're watching us from. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.